Imagine, 1947, Europe in ruins, cities destroyed, factories not working, people starving, and suddenly America offers $13 billion in aid. Just like that. For free. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? But what if I told you that this aid changed the world more than any war? That it determined who would be rich and who would be poor for the next 70 years? And that we still live in the world created by the Marshall Plan. Today we'll unpack the most controversial question in post-war history. Was this generous help for a devastated Europe, or a brilliant plan to establish control over half the world? Let's start with what history textbooks don't write about. In the spring of 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall gave a speech at Harvard that changed everything. He said, "Europe needs help, and America is ready to provide it." But here's what's interesting. The aid was offered to everyone, including the Soviet Union. Yes, you heard that right. Stalin was also offered this money, and you know what happened? The USSR refused. Moreover, it forced all the countries of Eastern Europe that were already in its sphere of influence to refuse. Poland and Czechoslovakia wanted to accept the aid, but Moscow said no. Why? Because Stalin immediately understood. You'd have to report on this money. You'd have to open up your economy. You'd have to show where the funds were going, and that meant losing control. Here's your first lesson. There's no such thing as free money. There are always conditions. The only question is how beneficial these conditions are for the recipient. And here we come to the most interesting part. What exactly did Europe get for this money? Let's take a concrete example, France. The country was completely destroyed by war. Industry was operating at a third of pre-war levels. People were receiving 1,200 calories per day. That's less than needed just to survive. Inflation was skyrocketing. The Communist Party was gaining strength, and it seemed that France was about to slide either into chaos or under Moscow's influence. And then the Marshall Plan arrives. Over 4 years, France receives about $2.7 billion. This money buys machinery, raw materials, food. But most importantly, the money doesn't just go to restoring the old, it goes to modernization. New factories are built, infrastructure is updated, a modern economy is created. By 1951, industrial production in France had grown by 40% compared to pre-war levels. Not recovered recovery happened earlier, but grew. The same thing happened in West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands. Everywhere the Marshall Plan went, a boom began. The European economic miracle wasn't an accident. It was the result of massive investment and smart planning. It would seem everything is wonderful. America helped, Europe recovered, everyone's happy. But let's dig deeper. What did America demand in return? First, all countries receiving aid had to coordinate their actions. A special organization was created to monitor the distribution of funds. Second, they had to lower trade barriers and open markets. Third, mandatory purchase of American goods. Yes, most of the money returned to the USA through purchases of American equipment, grain, coal. And here's where the most controversial part begins. Critics say, this isn't aid, it's creating a market. America simply found a way to sell its products and at the same time tie Europe to itself economically. And it was also a way to prevent Europe from turning left. Remember I mentioned the communists in France? Well, they were very strong. In Italy, too. In Greece, there was a civil war between communists and the government. The Marshall Plan stabilized the economy so quickly that people simply didn't need a revolution. Why risk it if things are already getting better? It turns out the plan wasn't about charity. It was about geopolitics. About creating a system in Europe that would be economically and politically connected to America. And you know what? It worked brilliantly. But here's the question. Is this good or bad for Europe itself? Let's look at the other side of the coin. There are countries that didn't receive Marshall Plan aid. Eastern Europe, as we remember, refused. What happened to them? Take Czechoslovakia, one of the most developed countries in Europe before the war. In 1947, it wanted to accept aid, but the USSR forbade it, and then began what's called the Soviet model of recovery. Instead of investment in modernization, centralized planning and total control. Instead of open markets, a closed economy. Instead of integration with the West, complete isolation. By 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell, the difference between Western and Eastern Europe was colossal. West Germany became one of the richest countries in the world. East Germany barely made ends meet. Living standards differed by multiples. You could say this wasn't because of the Marshall Plan, but because of communism. Fair enough. But the fact remains, countries that accepted aid developed faster and better. They became part of the Western world, part of a common market that later turned into the European Union. They received not just money, they received a ticket to the club of developed countries. And now, the most uncomfortable question: could Europe have recovered on its own without American aid? Honestly, yes, but much slower and much more painfully. The Marshall Plan provided what was lacking: time and resources. It allowed skipping years of poverty and chaos and moving straight to growth. That's worth a lot. But there was control nevertheless, and it's important to understand this. America gained enormous influence over European politics. It dictated trade terms, influenced internal decisions, created military alliances. NATO, for example, is a direct consequence of the Marshall Plan. First economic integration, then military. Europe became America's junior partner, not an equal partner, but specifically a junior one. Critics on the right say America saved Europe from communism and created a prosperous world. Critics on the left say America bought Europe and turned it into its colony. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. It was a deal, mutually beneficial but unequal. Europe got money and development. America got influence and markets. Who won more depends on how you count. Now, let's fast forward to today. Why is this story still relevant? Because the world is again full of talk about big investment plans. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, investing hundreds of billions in infrastructure around the world. Is this a new Marshall Plan? In many ways, yes. The same scheme. We give money, build roads, ports, factories, and in return, we get influence and access to markets. And the reaction is the same. Some countries happily accept Chinese investment. Others fear they'll fall into a debt trap and lose sovereignty. Sri Lanka, for example, couldn't repay its loan to China and leased a strategic port to them for 99 years. Sound familiar? This is control through investment. Or take the European Union and its aid programs for Eastern European countries after the collapse of the USSR. The same logic. We give money, you carry out reforms, open markets, integrate into our structures. Poland, Czech Republic, the Baltic states accepted this aid and became part of the EU. And today, they're much richer than their neighbors who went a different path. So what do we have? The Marshall Plan showed the world a simple truth. Economic aid is an instrument of power, not necessarily bad, not necessarily good, just an instrument. Everything depends on how it's used and what goals are pursued. America used it to create a world in its own image, and in many ways, it succeeded. But let's be honest, this world turned out pretty good for those who got into it. Western Europe has lived 75 years without major wars. It became one of the richest and safest regions on the planet. Yes, the price was dependence on America. Yes, the price was loss of part of sovereignty. But the alternative, which we see in the example of Eastern Europe, was worse. It turns out there's a paradox. The Marshall Plan was simultaneously both a generous gesture and cold calculation. It saved millions of lives and at the same time strengthened American hegemony. It gave Europe a chance at prosperity and at the same time tied it to itself. It's not black and white, it's gray, very gray. So what's the bottom line? Marshall Plan investment or control? The answer, both. It was an investment that paid off 100-fold for both sides, and it was control that determined the world order for decades to come. It was a brilliant political move disguised as humanitarian aid, or vice versa humanitarian aid that accidentally turned out to be a brilliant political move. The lesson for us today is this. When you're offered big money, always ask for what. When you see aid programs, always look at the conditions. And when someone says, we just want to help, remember, nobody gives away billions just like that. Behind every big gesture stands a big strategy. The Marshall Plan proved this once and for all. If this video made you think about how the world really works, give it a like. If you want more breakdowns of historical events that defined our present, subscribe to the channel. And in the comments write, what do you think? If the USSR had accepted the Marshall Plan, how would history have changed? I'm genuinely interested in your opinion. Thanks for watching to the end. See you in the next video where we'll unpack another myth from history textbooks.